You've probably been told monogamy is natural, that jealousy is hardwired into every human being, that ancient humans lived in a brutal free-for-all before marriage came along and saved us from ourselves. Almost none of that holds up. The archaeological and anthropological record tells a very different story. One where early humans built flexible, negotiated, deeply social, intimate lives, and, by several real measures, more stable ones than most people manage today. This is what actually happened. Let's be clear about what we're comparing. Not wedding vows, not divorce court, not anything resembling the nuclear household you grew up picturing as normal. We're talking about small bands of 15 to 50 people living inside arrangements built on cooperation, obligation, and constant negotiation. Monogamy, as a strict lifelong pairing enforced by law and religion, is a relatively recent invention. For most of human history, intimate life ran on different rules entirely, and those rules were more varied, more improvised, and more responsive to circumstance than almost anyone assumes. Start with the biology, because that's where the myth falls apart fastest. Humans are what biologists call mildly polygynous by anatomy, not strictly monogamous. Compare the numbers. Truly monogamous species show almost no difference in size between males and females, and almost no competition for mates. Species built around one male controlling many females show enormous size gaps, sometimes double. Humans sit in between. Men are on average larger than women, but not by nearly as much as in species where a handful of males father almost every offspring. That middle ground is a clue. It tells you humans evolved for a mating system with some competition, some pairing, and a lot of flexibility, not the all-or-nothing picture people carry around in their heads. The testes tell a similar story. Researchers studying sperm competition across primates found that species with highly promiscuous mating systems, like chimpanzees, evolved proportionally large testes to compete inside a female's body after mating. Strictly monogamous species evolve small ones, since there's no competition to prepare for. Human testes sit in the middle of that range too, larger than a gorilla's, smaller than a chimpanzee's. Biology rarely lies about this kind of thing. It suggests ancestral humans weren't locked into either extreme. They were built for something more mixed. Anthropologist Helen Fisher spent decades studying pair bonding across cultures and found something worth sitting with. Long-term partnerships appear almost everywhere humans live, but long-term rarely meant for life, the way it does in a modern wedding vow. Fisher's research on divorce patterns across dozens of societies, from foraging bands to industrial nations, found a strikingly consistent pattern. Relationships were statistically most likely to end around the 4-year mark, roughly the time it takes to raise a single child through its most vulnerable infant years. She called it the 4-year itch. The pattern shows up in Malaysia, Finland, the United States, and small-scale societies with no contact with any of them. That's not a flaw in human wiring. That's the wiring. Now here's where it gets more interesting, because pairing and exclusivity turn out to be two completely separate things. Anthropologists studying societies that still practice something closer to ancestral living arrangements found systems built around serial and layered partnerships rather than single, lifelong ones. Among the Ache of Paraguay and the Bari of Venezuela and Colombia, researchers documented what's called partible paternity, the belief, and often the biological reality, that a single child can have contributions from more than one man. In these systems, several men might take on real responsibility for the same child's survival. This wasn't disorder, it was distributed protection, and children raised inside these systems tended to survive childhood at higher rates than children with only one recognized father. The Himba of Namibia offer a different angle on the same idea. Anthropologist Brooke Skelza spent years studying their marriage customs and found something that upends another assumption. Extramarital relationships were common, openly tolerated, and rarely destroyed a marriage. Women maintained formal husbands for stability and status, alongside other relationships that Skelza's data showed produced real genetic outcomes. A notable share of children in the community were fathered outside the formal marriage, openly enough that co-wives and husbands often knew and adjusted around it. Marriage did real work in Himba life. It just wasn't doing the same work modern marriage is asked to do. This changes the whole picture because it means exclusivity wasn't the point of ancestral intimacy. Cooperation was. A woman's relationships weren't judged by how contained they were, but by how much support they generated for her and her children. A man's status wasn't built on possessing one partner completely, but on the strength of his ties across the group. Closeness bought protection. It bought food security. It bought allies. Monogamy, when it did appear, usually showed up as one strategy among several, not a universal rule stamped into human nature. The physical side of ancestral life reinforced all of this. Ethnographic studies of the Hadza in Tanzania and the Juhanzi in the Kalahari recorded constant physical contact throughout ordinary days: communal childcare, shared sleeping spaces, group grooming, casual touch that carried no romantic weight at all. Intimacy wasn't rationed to one relationship because there was no scarcity model driving it. Touch, care, and closeness moved freely through the entire group. Compare that to modern life, where a single partner is often expected to be the sole source of physical affection, emotional processing, financial partnership, and social identity all at once. That's an enormous weight to put on one relationship, and it's a weight ancestral humans almost never carried alone. Then there's the historical record, which shows monogamy arriving late and arriving for very specific reasons, not because it matched some deep biological truth. Anthropologists studying the transition to agriculture found that strict pair bonding tightened as private property, inheritance, and land ownership became central to survival. Once a family had land, livestock, or wealth to pass down, knowing exactly who a child's father was became economically critical. Monogamy, in large part, followed property. It wasn't discovered, it was engineered, slowly, over thousands of years, as a solution to an economic problem that ancestral humans simply didn't have. Anthropologist Laura Betzig, studying the rise of early empires, found that formal monogamy tended to spread fastest wherever centralized states needed stable, countable households to tax and conscript. A monogamous household is easier to register, easier to regulate, easier to fit into a census than the looser, overlapping arrangements it replaced. Ancestral flexibility didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because it stopped being convenient for the systems being built on top of it. None of this means ancestral life was some kind of jealousy-free utopia. The ethnographic record is full of disputes over partners, full of tension, full of moments where desire and obligation pulled against each other, exactly the way they do now. Jealousy existed. Possessiveness existed. This wasn't paradise. But the structure of daily life made total isolation almost impossible, and it made intimate arrangements far more negotiable than the rigid all-or-nothing model most people inherit today. You couldn't quietly resent a partner for years without anyone noticing. The group saw everything, and the group had a stake in resolving it. Compare that to how relationships function now. Two people, often alone in an apartment, expected to meet every emotional and physical need for each other with no wider support system absorbing the pressure. Anthropologist Helen Fisher has pointed out that modern monogamy asks the human brain to do something it was never built to do in isolation: sustain total exclusivity, total emotional labor, and total physical intimacy through one single bond, without the surrounding web of camp life that used to share that load. We took a system built for a village and asked it to run on two people. There's also the matter of what modern monogamy actually gets right, because the picture isn't purely one of loss. Pair bonding itself is ancient and real. Oxytocin, the hormone tied to trust and attachment, rises during repeated closeness with a single partner, just as it does with a group. Long-term partnership offers something ancestral group living didn't always guarantee: consistency, deep familiarity, a single person who knows your entire history, start to finish. The mistake isn't valuing that. The mistake is assuming it's the only configuration humans are built for, and treating every other historical arrangement as some kind of failure state. Here's the part that's easy to miss. Ancestral humans weren't more enlightened about relationships, and they weren't secretly living some kind of free love ideal either. They were responding rationally to their circumstances. When survival depended on a wide web of cooperation, intimacy spread out to match it. When survival started depending on private property and inheritance, intimacy narrowed to match that instead. Humans didn't evolve one hardwired mating system. They evolved flexibility, and different environments pulled that flexibility in different directions, generation after generation, without anyone designing it on purpose. We built a world with more privacy, more choice, and more individual control over relationships than any humans in history have ever had. And somehow, with all of that control, a huge number of people report their closest relationship as their loneliest one, carrying alone what an entire camp used to carry together. They didn't need a vow to make intimacy work. They needed a group. We swapped the group for a promise, and we're still finding out what that trade actually cost.